So today we're going to start taking in our monthly news stories, with a focus in this episode on the 4 stage shows that have recently opened at the Orlando parks. I'm out in Florida at the moment, and from the wonky acoustics here, I should probably tell you that I'm recording this in my hotel room. I'm staying in one of the duo rooms over at the Poly Tower. These are the smaller rooms meant for 1 or 2 people. I've tried to dampen the space a little, but it's, well, let's just say, not perfect. And just so you know, that whooshing sound in the background is the monorail going by. You'll probably hear it later in the episode. I do have some thoughts on the Poly Tower. I was here when it opened, and I've been here for the last few days, but we'll talk about them on a future episode. Today, we're focused on other things. We'll start off by talking about the opening of Epic Universe and the difficult position Universal is now in, trying to increase revenue while not creating a social media problem for themselves. We'll talk about the 2 newly opened shows at Epic Universe, and then we'll talk about the 2 brand new stage shows over at Disney. And here's a spoiler. How I initially imagined the ranking of these 4 shows is not at all where they ended up after I've seen them. And I've seen all 4 shows at least twice now. So we've got some interesting stories to cover, and if you're ready, let's roll. So last month, we spent a couple of episodes talking about Epic Universe, but we set aside the 2 stage shows there, as those no doubt would be compared to the 2 new stage shows over at Disney that opened this past week. So we're going to talk about all of those things today. But first this. On May 22nd, Epic Universe had its grand opening with ceremonies throughout the park. But the one thing that I want to highlight here is the queue time, particularly for Battle of the Ministry of Magic. During opening day, the queue time for the Battle of the Ministry got up to 300 minutes. A photo of the Universal team member holding that 300-minute wait time sign just outside the extended queue area was then posted across socials. And then it was picked up by news websites and news organizations. A photo of that sign hit Middie Theme Park websites. It was picked up by Channel 2 Wesh News, a Central Florida NBC affiliate, and other TV stations. Photos of that sign then migrated to larger sites such as People and Yahoo News. And then some people at home started to have a little bit of fun with Photoshop. Among the altered versions I saw was one of this same Universal team member with that same 300-minute sign, but now with a little photoshopping, he was standing in MCO near the TSA line, as though the line for Ministry stretched all the way from Epic over to the Orlando airport. Then there was another altered version of this same team member and sign standing outside of the Land Pavilion in Epcot, as though the line for Battle now moved all the way across town and over onto Disney property. But here's the thing. From the people I talked to associated with Universal, this spooked a lot of Universal executives. Universal didn't want the first large impression of their new theme park to be one that led people to believe it was a place filled with endless lines. In fairness, I should point out that Universal had limited attendance for the grand opening, and a 5-hour-long queue only showed up for that one ride. The other attractions had far shorter wait times. Many attractions had wait times at 30 or 45 minutes or less. And also that line for the Harry Potter ride got down under 3 hours later in the day. But again, as I understand it, Universal didn't want this to be the initial narrative that defined the park on socials. Negative impressions on socials can be very difficult to undo, especially when they are the initial impression that the public has. Just look at how difficult it's been for Disney to undo the narrative that Disney World is extremely expensive, that initially took root on socials. Even when the Disney Resort presently has a 4-day summer ticket for Florida residents at $60 per day. Disney has been trying to climb out of this identity for years. To manage the initial social impression, though, Universal appears to have significantly dialed down ticket sales for Epic Universe, at least through June. But defeating that narrative that there will be long lines here, which will definitely be true once the park opens up to something closer to normal operating capacity, but defeating that narrative too has proven difficult, as Battle for the Ministry is the most popular attraction in the park. As I write this on Wednesday, May 28th, I can see that earlier in the day, 15 minutes after Epic opened, the queue for Battle of the Ministry was again at 240 minutes or 4 hours long. I'd also say that today, which is again May 28th, based on wait times throughout the park, Universal has started to raise overall attendance levels as there are finally many attractions with more than an hour wait. Mario Kart today hit 3 hours, Minecart Madness hit over 2, and so on. So in this, Universal is adjusting every few days to what the park and also its public reputation can now manage. In terms of just Battle for the Ministry, queue times tend to peak in the morning and then taper off throughout the day. Also, Ministry is still plagued with a lot of downtime. Still, today's average wait time for Ministry of the Magic, again as I write this, which is just after 3 in the afternoon, is 188 minutes or just over 3 hours, slightly down from its peak earlier today of 4 hours. If you check the Universal website for single-day tickets, you'll find that for the rest of the month of June, there are only 2 days with availability. They are June 3rd and June 15th, and that's it for single-day tickets up until July 4th. I've been told that if you're staying on property over at Universal, you can likely get a ticket if you check with the front desk or the concierge. But the lack of tickets here is not because the park is at or even near capacity. It's partly to manage the park's initial image. At least right now, it's easy to see how Universal is planning to expand capacity. There are little jumps between individual days. For example, yesterday, May 27th, clearly had a lower number of people at the park compared to today. But mostly the capacity jumps are done in blocks. Again, as I look at the schedule right now, there are only 2 days between now and July 3rd that have availability for single-day tickets. But every day for the rest of the summer, starting July 4th, has availability. So that's the date that Universal appears to be eyeing right now to expand out capacity in some significant way. It is possible that the Battle at the Ministry has less downtime by this point, which would be very helpful. And it's also possible that Universal believes that the initial 6 weeks of regular operation from May 22nd up through July 3rd might be enough to set up an overall positive image of the park on socials before larger crowds arrive. But this generally is the issue that Universal is exploring. They have date-based or date range-based tickets for Epic, so park management and operations can easily increase sales as they feel the park and the park's image can manage it. But I'm pretty sure that this is not how Universal initially imagined the first month and a half for Epic Universe. One of the blows is lower overall international visitation to the U.S. this year, particularly from Canada. This hurts not only the potential pool of park visitors, but more importantly, room reservations at its hotels. Another problem is that Americans are feeling economic uncertainty about the near future, and therefore delaying more expensive vacations such as trips to Central Florida. Still, another element in this mix is the way that narratives on social media can help or hurt a park for months or years to come. Neither Disney nor Universal has opened a major park in the US since the advent of social media. In some ways, this is relatively new territory. If you open a single attraction, that attraction's, its problems or long lines mostly speak only to that attraction. Think of Hagrid's Motorbike Adventure or Rise of the Resistance at Disney. Both attractions had deep reliability issues shortly after opening. But as these were new rides being added to established parks, no one thought that the problems or long lines for these two attractions would somehow represent the park experience overall. However, if you open a new park, one that the public doesn't yet have experience with, a headliner attraction with a long line can appear to speak for the entire park, even if the long line at Battle of the Ministry doesn't always represent all of the attractions around it. Simply because the public doesn't yet have a strong understanding of the rest of the park, it can easily assume that one piece represents the whole endeavor. Casual scrollers on Facebook or Insta will see the 300-minute sign and then possibly assume the rest of the park is equally crowded, even if that's not always true, or at least if it's not true right now. But that generally is the difficult path Universal is on. Artificially reduced capacity, I'd say that even though Universal doesn't release daily numbers, that the park is still under 20,000 people per day, even with the small bump in attendance levels it saw today. A good guess might be that Epic is seeing somewhere around 17,000 or 18,000 guests each day right now. And then the deep and endless availability of one-day tickets starting July 4th suggests that this is the next point where Epic Universe will begin to experiment with attendance above 20,000. Again, a guess might be that in early July, Epic will shift to around 22 to 25,000, which is still nowhere near operational capacity of the park. And then somewhere around fall, with Halloween Horror Nights and Food and Wine over at Disney, Epic will probably push that even further. But also I should note that with date-based tickets, if Universal sees that some attractions, and mainly here I'm thinking Battle at the Ministry, is operating at a higher level of reliability, they can open up a few hundred or even a few thousand more tickets for purchase for tomorrow or the day after. Date-based tickets allows that level of granular adjustment from day to day as executives find ways to better manage the park and as certain attractions become more reliable. From the guest standpoint, this also means that even if you don't find a ticket for next weekend, Universal might open more spots for that day as we get closer to the date. Also, if you do go, just remember right now that park patterns suggest that the long lines for Ministry mostly spike in the first hour that the park is open and then tend to taper off in the afternoon and then again in the evening. But this is not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about a new pair of shows over at Epic that premiered with the park, and perhaps even more interestingly, a new pair of shows that just opened this past week at Disney World. Two elaborate new stage shows opened earlier this week at Disney. I've seen them, and also two elaborate new stage shows opened at Epic. I've seen those as well. So let's talk about what's working and how this small battle is contributing to the larger battle between Universal and Disney in Florida. And in this section, I will talk about the underlying narrative conceit for all four shows. But largely these shows, each running between 15 and 23 minutes, aren't about telling complex stories. They use story as the structure to either present engaging visual experiences or to present a series of well-delivered songs, or perhaps both. That is, unlike a movie or a miniseries or a novel, narrative is not the component that most grabs our attention here. Narrative is more of a tool to deliver other interesting experiences, but still you've been warned, there be spoilers ahead. Let's start out over at Epic Universe, since those two shows opened shortly before those at Disney. Epic has two elaborate stage shows, Le Cirque Arcanu and The Untrainable Dragon. The elaborate queue for Le Cirque Arcanu winds through an enormous circus tent, past posters for sideshow performers, an antique calliope, equipment for daredevil acts, a ticket booth, and a trapeze for aerial performers hung from the roof. As you move through this queue space, which is quite long, the music shifts from 1920s jazz to slightly more menacing carnival music, suggesting that something is amiss at Le Cirque Arcanu. The final room in the queue, which is filled with empty cages and empty circus carts, is also where the pre-show takes place. The pre-show, like the main show, is a collection of human actors, screen characters, such as those house elves, puppet characters, and presentations of stage magic illusions worked into the story. The pre-show begins when those two house elves are wondering why so many guests are coming to see the circus today, especially as it no longer has any unique beasts. And here's the basic setup for Le Cirque Arcanu. In the films, Le Cirque Arcanu is mostly associated with the second Fantastic Beasts movie, The Crimes of Grindelwald. The circus, overseen by the cruel ringmaster Skender, is now largely a presentation of human performers with unusual abilities. But the show has fallen on hard times and now needs more compelling acts to attract a large audience. To get these acts, Ringmaster Skender and one of his house elves has acquired Newt Scamander's magical suitcase. You know, the one from the movie. That appears to be a regular suitcase, but once it's opened, Newt and his friends can climb down into its hidden depths, where there's a space large enough to hold an enormous zoo of fantastical beasts. These creatures range from the small leaf-like bowtruckles to the platypus-like nifflers and the enormous arumpet, which appears like an overgrown rhino with a little bit of elephant mixed in. Once the suitcase is with the circus, and this also happens during the pre-show, an assistant, Gwendolyn, opens the suitcase and inadvertently allows one of the creatures to escape. The creature is a demiguise. Think of a white snow monkey with large eyes, a white snow monkey who is about the size of a small person. The creature is played by an acrobat dressed in a furry white suit, who climbs up out of that suitcase and then scampers into the main performance tent just before us, the audience, is led into the same area to find a seat. The main presentation begins when human performers present unusual feats, much in the style of Cirque du Soleil. A man twirls and balances see-through boxes, then another performer blows up soap bubbles which he then juggles, and then also soap bubbles filled with mist fall from the sky. If you pop one of those bubbles by your seat, you'll see that the mist remains floating in the air. The last performer in the set is a female aerialist who performs trapeze-style tricks on a Quidditch broom. But just as her act concludes, that demiguise, remember that short white snow monkey creature, wanders onto the stage with Gwendolyn chasing him with the suitcase. But when Gwendolyn opens that suitcase, urging the creature back inside, the entire stage begins to transform. And at this point, it's clear that the mechanics of the stage have been built specifically to support this particular story. The floor of the stage rises slowly, with Gwendolyn still on it, up into the catwalk area in the upper reaches of the building. And then a folding set of stairs descends down from the original stage, now up by the proscenium, down to the new stage, which represents the inside of Newt Scamander's suitcase filled with magical beasts. As Gwendolyn climbs down those stairs, she enters into the realm of the suitcase, where there are animatronic beasts, puppet beasts, actors costumed as beasts, and beasts that appear on screens. It is in this section where the show incorporates some stage magic to tell its story, including one effect that I simply don't know how it's done. And finally, Newt Scamander appears via screen, coming back to help save his creatures. This is an expensive, well-designed, engaging performance with large stage equipment that was uniquely arranged for this production. It uses stagecraft tools that have been showing up on Broadway over the past half dozen or so years. It also combines acting, puppetry, animatronics, acrobatics, music, choreographed feats, and elements of stage magic into a visually compelling presentation. It runs about 23 minutes. On the other side of Epic Universe, on the Isle of Berk, is the other new stage show, The Untrainable Dragon. The show is nearly identical to the show Untrainable that premiered at Universal Studios Beijing 4 years ago. At Epic Universe, The Untrainable Dragon is performed in a theater at the far edge, what is almost a side alcove at the back of the Isle of Berk. Unlike Le Cirque Arcanu, there is no themed queue, no pre-show area. It's arranged as a traditional civic theater. You walk in, you sit down, you wait for the show to start. And I point this out for 3 reasons. First, Le Cirque is the more expensive attraction to deliver by a lot. Second, Le Cirque has a much deeper, immersive presentation through the entire experience. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it wouldn't be difficult at some point in the future, let's say in 5 or 7 years, for Universal to install a new show into this building, whereas to install a new non-circus themed show over in the Le Cirque complex would require demo and construction. That is, this space, just at the edge of the Isle of Berk, can be a black box area that Universal can repurpose with different shows in years to come if it wants to do that. Again, story here is not the central pleasure for this presentation, so I'll set it up for you fairly quickly. A new dragon arrives at the Isle of Berk, one apparently more angry than other dragons, and threatens to destroy the dragon egg hatchery and, by extension, parts of the village. The question now is, why is this dragon so angry? Not believing that this dragon is untrainable, Hiccup and Toothless discover that this so-called untrainable dragon, rather than being destructive, is simply trying to reclaim her egg, which had been accidentally placed in the hatchery. The show closes when the egg hatches, uniting mother and baby dragon together. But this very basic narrative provides structure for more impressive aspects of the performance. At the heart of the show are 2 animatronic dragons. The untrainable dragon is a massive construction, whose wings, when fully open, nearly cover the whole stage from top to bottom. The other is the signature icon for the show. When Hiccup enters the story, he flies above the audience on an animatronic toothless dragon. Ideally, Hiccup and Toothless fly through puffs of man-made fog, making it look like they're circling down and gliding through the clouds. But when I was at Epic for technical previews, the fog effects weren't working. I would assume that fog effects also help conceal the wires that support both Toothless the dragon and his rider Hiccup. Fog or no fog, though, the effect is spectacular. A black dragon with a wingspan of around 27 feet glides over the entire audience before landing on stage where Hiccup steps off. The other centerpiece is the arrangement of music to advance the story. The band divides itself on either half of the stage on raised platforms, and then sings narrative lyrics that tell the story of the island, while actors on stage act out that story. It reminded me of a bit of the staging of an experimental Broadway production from a little over a year ago called Illinois, though of course the original Untrainable predates that show. But what I mean to point out is this production here is looking for unique ways to pair music with action. Ultimately, I think the story and the music won't be elements that viewers, and particularly younger viewers, take away from the experience. There's no song here that you would sing while leaving the theater. The takeaway here for most viewers will be the dragon and rider flying overhead, ideally through some man-made clouds. But also in all of this, there's some unusual pairings. The simple story, particularly one focused on a lost child, and the dragon effect are mostly pitched towards kids, but the music and musical presentation are arranged for a far more older audience. The songs are beautiful, but none of them are catchy or memorable in a way that younger viewers would warm to. And if you've already listened to my review of the Isle of Berk posted a few weeks ago, you'll know that this is my main point of confusion for how the Isle of Berk was arranged. The Isle of Berk, based on an animated film series, should be Universal's version of Fantasyland, a place focused on experiences that can be fully enjoyed by parents and their young children. But at most every turn here, from an Isle of Berk coaster with a somewhat high height requirement to an extreme version of the Dumbo flying spinners that require over-the-shoulder coaster-style rider restraints, it seems that the initial vision for a Fantasyland-style area at Universal was continually aged up so that it only partially speaks to the needs and interests of younger children now. And so here we have a lovely experimental musical setup with songs that are pitched far more to adult viewers, paired with a story and effects arranged for younger viewers. And overall, I think that all of these things together just create a missed opportunity for Universal to really bring over some of those families with younger children that are now at the Magic Kingdom. But this overall is a strong show, particularly with those dragon effects. Universal spent a good deal of money here to bring these flying creatures to the stage, and it's a well-arranged presentation. And there's one thing I should also point out. If you have young kids and don't want to wait in the line for the toothless meet and greet, which in recent days has had a wait time of between 60 and 100 minutes, if you sit up front at the show near the center, you'll be very close to Toothless. True, you won't be able to pet him, nor can you get a photo with him here inside the theater, but you'll only be a few feet away. But this might be a good substitute if you and your family don't want to brave the hour or hour and a half to meet Toothless just down the way in the Isle of Berk. If I had to rank these two shows, I would easily put Le Cirque Arcanu in the top spot with the Untrainable Dragon in the second spot. And honestly, after I saw these, I sort of figured that the two Disney productions, in terms of where I would place them in this ranking, would come in below the two shows at Universal, particularly the new Villain show, which I believe was put together in about a year. But that's not where things ended up. To be honest, my final impression surprised me. And what was clear after I'd seen those shows at Disney was this. As these shows are the centerpiece attraction for the summer lineup at the Florida resort, Disney has thrown a lot of money at them to make sure that the two 15 to 20 minute productions ended up being as good as they could be. So now let's venture down the I-4 and look at what's at the Disney Resort. Over at Disney, both of the new shows are at Hollywood Studios. Villains Unfairly Ever After is back in the black box theater space, once occupied by Lightning McQueen's Racing Academy. And the reworked Little Mermaid, A Musical Adventure, is in the theater that was once home to Voyage of the Little Mermaid, but we'll start today with Villains. The show, as I mentioned, is housed in the black box theater space at the end of Sunset Boulevard, just beyond Rock and Roller Coaster. The theater, called the Sunset Showcase, opened back in 2015. Most recently, from 2019 up until last October, it was the home to Lightning McQueen's Racing Academy. This was a show that featured an impressive, full-sized animatronic of Lightning McQueen, talking to and racing with other characters from the Cars movies, arranged onto a widescreen behind him. If you saw that show, you should know up front that the entire theater space has been demoed and redone. It's now a much more traditional theater space. At the front of the room is the stage, and then rows of theater seats fill the remaining length of the room with the sound techs at the back. It now looks far more like a finished space, as opposed to an open shell that could be used for different experiences. Again, the story setup here is straightforward. The Magic Mirror has grown tired of listening to the complaints of other villains, all of whom apparently are trapped in the netherworld of other mirrors behind glass. All of them claiming that they have been treated unfairly. In fact, they're making the pitch that each of them has been the most unfairly treated of all. When three villains escape, and these are Cruella de Vil, Captain Hook, and Maleficent, the Magic Mirror lets the trio, one by one, explain their situation to the audience, who will then decide who has been treated the most unfairly. Just as at Epic, this show too isn't focused on story. The story is there primarily so the show can stitch together a series of digital effects and present a handful of songs. But unlike Untrainable Dragon, the songs here are memorable and will appeal to kids. The three villains each sing one song. Cruella, of course, sings Cruella de Vil, Captain Hook sings The Elegant Captain Hook, and Maleficent creates a song using melodies from Sleeping Beauty, including Once Upon a Dream. The Magic Mirror also has a song which is called Magic Mirror, which is both the first song in the show and the exit music. From my perspective, the amazing thing here is that all of these characters, Hook, Maleficent, Cruella, and even the Magic Mirror, are from Walt-era animated features. And there's a reason for this. Walt-era features tended to slant more toward battles between characters who were generally good and ones who were more or less evil. In more recent Disney offerings, the animated stories tend to slant away from classic villains. Encanto, Moana, Frozen 2, and so on, all feature villains who aren't necessarily evil, just misunderstood. Another set of recent films, such as the live-action Cruella and Maleficent films, also recast these villains as characters who have either been traumatized or whose life has been somewhat misrepresented. And other recent Disney offerings simply have no villain at all. This is particularly true for the Pixar catalog, with Inside Out, Finding Nemo, Finding Dory, Soul, Turning Red, and so on. But also, some films from Walt Disney Animation have no classic villain, such as Brother Bear, Strange World, and Bolt. It just represents an ongoing narrative shift in how we culturally think about stories for kids. So, though there might be more complex and more fully imagined heroes in the modern Disney era, the most memorable villains belong to the Walt era. Both the villain show and the new Little Mermaid show begin with a digital sequence, which a few years ago would have worried me. But since around 2020, both Universal and Disney have become more sophisticated with multifaceted digital presentations that these scenes tend to be compelling to watch. That is the case here. The Magic Mirror presents his song while around him a couple dozen additional mirrors hold images of other Disney villains, all clamoring for attention. The villains in the mirrors change throughout the show, but in the mix are some fairly deep cuts, including brief appearances by the Big Bad Wolf, the Horned King from The Black Cauldron, and those weasels from The Adventures of Mr. Toad. After the Magic Mirror introductory song ends, the three actors, and there are only 3 human actors in the whole production, come to the stage one at a time. It's possible that the stage would appear fuller with secondary characters or background dancers, but those actors playing these 3 roles have truly mastered the mannerisms, gestures, movement, and speech patterns of the characters they portray. The choreography for Cruella in particular moves her from one exaggerated menacing pose to another, which is exactly how the animator Mark Davis arranged her in the 1961 animated film. The Cruella on stage here looks and moves far more like the animated Cruella than either Glenn Close's or Emma Stone's portrayal of Cruella in later live-action films. Each of these 3 villains in songs puts forward a case that their villainy has been misunderstood. Cruella is just an artist with unusual taste in fur. Hook was a good captain to his men, but frustrated because Pan always bested him. And Maleficent claims that, well, without her, Sleeping Beauty and her prince would have never ended up together. And then for the closing act, the audience can pick one villain who they believe has been treated the most unfairly, and the winner changes from show to show, and this winner then remains on stage to perform another verse from their song. Along with the performers and the music, the third area of strength is the impressive use of digital technologies. What appears to be wallpaper on the sidewalls of the theater space is actually a digital projection that melts away and is replaced by artistic backgrounds for each of the 3 performers. The stage is surrounded by a couple dozen mirrors. Some of the mirrors are complete projections, while other are high-def video monitors. The face from the Magic Mirror throughout the show dashes from mirror to mirror, whether they be projections or fixed monitors, as he slides across the width of the stage. When the show is finally finished, with the most unfairly treated villain announced, the crowd exits the theater to a remix of the Magic Mirror song, which is far catchier than the songs over in The Untrainable Dragon. And if you like the song, you can find both versions of it on Apple Music, Spotify, iTunes, and so forth for both streaming and for digital purchase. For me, the other Disney show that premiered this past week was also a pleasant surprise. By the time it closed in 2020 for the pandemic, The Voyage of the Little Mermaid, with its puppets, laser effects, and water curtain, was looking pretty tired. A show that belonged to a very different era, specifically that of the 1990s. What has replaced it, though, is a far more technologically sophisticated adaptation of the animated movie into an 18-minute stage presentation. The performance here is what I would categorize as a jukebox overview of the film. That is, Disney assumes you know the story of The Little Mermaid, and now they're just replaying the most memorable musical numbers from the film, lightly linked together with small bits of familiar narrative. If you've never seen the film, I doubt that this show would really explain the story, but my guess is that nearly every member of the audience here has seen the film at least once. And also, in terms of the history of Disney, Mermaid is another kind of older film, not as old as those represented in the Villain show, But in 4 years, The Little Mermaid will be 40 years old. And after a decade-long set of presentations in the American parks of Brave, Moana, Frozen, Coco, and so on, it does seem like the parks are starting to rethink which films are best remembered by guests. And in some cases, the best remembered stories and characters are in recent films, and in some cases, they are in older films. Beyond the music here, the presentation on stage uses a combination of actors, puppets, costumed characters, and projections. The projections here at times are so sharp they appear real. In some cases, a character might move from a puppet form in one sequence to a projection form in another, but the closeness between their images at times makes it initially difficult to tell which is the projection and which is the puppet. Likewise, the projections are arranged in layers down the depth of the stage. At the front of the stage is a scrim, onto which are projected some images, such as seaweed, air bubbles, and fish, also accent colors for one of the songs. Behind that scrim is a narrow corridor inhabited by the human actors. And next to and behind that corridor is typically a place for the puppets. And behind the puppets are layered surfaces for multiple projections, each a different distance from the audience. So it feels like a truly dimensional digital space in which the actors and puppets live. Likewise, this show has some interesting visual effects. Ariel swims onto the stage while flipping her fin, where she eventually takes up her place sitting on an undersea rock. And the final battle out at sea between Ursula and Prince Eric is longer and far better arranged than what was in the original show, The Voyage of the Little Mermaid. So in 1 week, Disney upgraded 2 shows at Hollywood Studios so that they feel fresh and are visually engaging. Again, to be honest, I wasn't expecting much out of these 2 shows, and they each delivered far more than I had hoped. The one downside now is this. Both of these shows now point out how out of date other musical shows are at Hollywood Studios, such as Beauty and the Beast live on stage, and to a little lesser extent For the First Time in Forever. If I had to rank all 4 new shows, the 2 at Disney and the 2 at Epic, in the order at which I felt they were the most satisfying, I'd put them in this order. At the top in first place would be Le Cirque Arcanu. Second would be The Little Mermaid. Third would be Villains. And last, though I do want to point out it's a solid show, is The Untrainable Dragon. And again, one of my many takeaways here is how the underlying design culture at Disney and Universal tends to bring these offerings back to the center of their core audience. Disney is after multi-generational families and parents with young children. Both of their new shows fit that demographic very well. And Universal is after a slightly edgier tween to mid-30s demographic, and both of their new shows slant in that direction. But over at Disney, if you once thought that The Voyage of the Little Mermaid and Lightning McQueen's Racing Academy were merely pleasant places to escape the heat, there's far more there now than 15 minutes of air conditioning and a comfortable place to sit. Both Universal and Disney are starting to rethink how stagecraft elements, mostly invented for the Broadway and West End stages, might be integrated into theme parks to create shows that are more satisfying now than even some shows that were produced 5 or even 10 years ago. In our outro today, I want to go back and update our first story, the one about wait times at Epic Universe. I recorded that story 2 days ago, and over the 2-day interval, it's now become clear that Universal has meaningfully nudged up capacity at Epic Universe. The low crowds that were used to stave off unflattering reviews on socials are going away. Today again, Battle at the Ministry hit a 4-hour wait time, so if you've heard or seen online that the park was not so crowded after the grand opening ceremonies, that was true for about a week, but now it's far less true. And based on ticket availability, there's clearly another intended significant increase in capacity slotted to take place starting July 4th. So it's an interesting problem. Clearly, Universal needs the park to produce more revenue, but negative reviews on social might reduce long-term tourism in the months ahead. So this is one story that we'll watch over summer. And beyond that, of course, I'll be back here with a new episode next Sunday. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.